Schifrin from California, who will tell us everything on how to read CTG.
I want to thank Patrice for the opportunity to speak. I don't know very much about signal processing, and I must confess that some of the formulas that I've seen this morning are just a little foreign to me, and I don't converse in them as well, perhaps, as some of you. What I am here to try to do is to talk about a subject. It had occurred to me that maybe the subject, that the title of the talk could have been changed to an aphorism from Einstein, who talked about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the results to be different. What I'm here to try to do is something which I'm trying to provide some clinical intuition into the requirements that people who are going to automate the process, which I believe is eminently possible and probable, although I must say I think although I'm heartened by some of the approaches from this morning, I think that some of the approaches that have been taken really are perpetuating a long-standing problem. The question is, does it matter? Does what we do with fetal monitors in fact matter? And the fact is that, as has been pointed out in several of the lectures, that we have not made over the last 4 decades or thereabout much progress in the risk of adverse long-term outcome in the fetuses. We are in fact also facing the challenge that some people are about to give up on fetal monitoring. If they aren't giving up, they are considering giving up on fetal monitoring, which would, from my point of view, be a terrible thing. Part of the problem deals with this statistic. This is the relationship of perinatal asphyxia to adverse outcomes and cerebral palsy. And what I'd like you to do is make up a number, any number you wish, and I will find an experiment that confirms that number. So whatever number you have as the relationship of cerebral palsy and asphyxia, I'm sure if it is less than 50%, that I can find a study to support you. We had in the United States something called the category system, category 1, 2, and 3, a categorization of fetal monitor tracings that I believe was designed more to protect the obstetrician than it was the fetus. It created a category called category 2, is an incomprehensible category, which I believe, as I'll try to show you in a moment, made the learning of and the understanding of fetal heart rate patterns unteachable. In an attempt to refine, if you will, the interpretation, especially of this category 2 pattern, there was a publication by 18 highly placed members of the obstetrical community in the United States, and they proposed a solution. As part of the discussion of this proposal, they said the body of work has primarily to serve to raise more questions than it has answered, and the fact is that we have more questions about fetal monitoring now than we did 30 years ago. They went on to study the effect of this algorithm that they had proposed, and the references there for you. And the reality is it did not work, not very well, number one. And number two, what they were trying to detect was the metabolic acidosis, and these are the results of their use of this strategy to predict acidosis. It didn't do very well. They intervened on less than half of them, but the important feature was the relationship of metabolic acidosis to adverse outcome, and these are only immediate outcome. And if you look at the red line, you can see that even with very severe acidosis greater than 15, base deficit greater than 15, that is less than 20%, have low APGAR scores. 42, in fact, go to the ICU, but very few of them. The fact is that metabolic acidosis is a risk factor for injury. Under no circumstances is it a surrogate. If you look at large studies, you find that the relationship of pH to adverse outcome is poor, to say the least, and this is the range of cases in which there is either encephalopathy or death, and you can see that the highest point is black. That's 721 to 725. And all the deaths are in the white because, as you come to learn, low pH is a better predictor of death than it is, in fact, of acidosis. And that's what this slide shows, that the false positive rate, especially for the prediction of cerebral palsy, is the false positive rate is very high. It is somewhat better for the prediction of death. It is simply not a viable measure in a sense of ultimate neurologic survival. This is a very important quote, I think, from Levine and Chervenak, and it says, when we think about the impact on the brain of clinical asphyxia, it will be critical to keep in mind that this definition tells us much about things that can be measured relatively easily and tells us nothing about the blood pressure or the perfusion of the brain. You cannot use pH to determine cerebral perfusion, and I shall show you some experiments to support that. The problem is if you use pH and you believe it's as important, it is important, it narrows the perspective of adverse outcomes related to intrapartum care. It underestimates the true incidence of perinatal harm, and it underestimates the preventability of injury, and it underestimates what we as clinicians can do. It's all because you want to use pH. I need to distinguish for you two models of injury. One is the model of injury, the hypoxic model of injury, where because of progressive hypoxia and acidemia, the baby runs out of energy, uses up what glucose it has, becomes increasingly acidotic, cannot buffer the acid, its heart becomes dysfunctional, it diminishes its cardiac output, and that ischemia, that lack of blood flow, that perfusion defect of the brain is the source of the hypoxic ischemic brain injury that we see. I want to share with you that there is yet another model of injury, and that model of injury, how shall we call it, the mechanical model of injury, and that in fact represents a more direct approach to the final problem of diminished cerebral blood flow, and this has to do with the mechanical events of labor and delivery, the impact on the fetal head, and I will describe that in considerable detail in a moment. I call your attention, and we have, this should be a very familiar slide to Professor Lear, and this is the basis for the use of cooling. This is the basis, this is the animal experimentation that provided the basis for cooling. The most important feature is the little lamb on the upper right. That lamb was not made asphyxia. Baby was not asphyxiated by diminishing the oxygen availability to the fetus. They went in and clamped the carotid, or a branch thereof. That has nothing to do with asphyxia. That is the model and the basis for the timing and the use of hypothermia for the prevention of hypoxic ischemic injury. A model that has nothing to do with severe progressive systemic acidosis in the fetus. It may be, you may be familiar with the notion that encephalopathy, that the severity of the encephalopathy is critically dependent on survival. That is no longer understood to be true. What we have come to understand is that even if you have mild hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, neonatal encephalopathy of a mild degree, the amount of impairment is significant, and the number of magnetic MRI abnormalities is at least as great as the more severe, more problematic condition, babies with more problematic conditions at birth. I hope that's clear, that there's something wrong with using pH to determine, or even the severity of encephalopathy, as a meaningful endpoint in what we are doing. It becomes critically important to identify certain semantic problems in this. I call your attention to a study from Maria Johnson from Sweden, and she did, for my point of view, made an appropriate study. And it is, I believe, important for not only her study, but for any other study that is done, is that you be able to define normal from the outset. Programs to define classifications, intervention systems have got to start with normal. If you don't start with normal, you're already behind the 8 ball, and you're not going to figure out what preventive care can do. And what Maria did was she took a group of babies, 80 with neonatal encephalopathy, and divided them according to whether the initial tracing was normal or abnormal. A very important distinction. And it is something that I believe you need to ask of every data set that comes here. You need to ask, was the baby normal at the outset? Number one. What she had is they missed one acid-base sample, so that left them with 50. Down the left side, these are the babies with previously normal tracings. There are 29 babies, 58% have HIE, and 50% of those have an adverse neurologic outcome. Consider now the babies who have normal tracings, do not have a low pH, but who have encephalopathy. Okay? 21 of them, 42%, 62% of them have adverse outcome. If you concentrate on those figures, you will have missed the most important point of the slide. What does she call the group of babies with normal pHs, encephalopathy, and bad outcome? She calls it no HIE. It can't be. It cannot be. So are we asking the right questions? Is it metabolic acidosis? Is it NICU? Is it low APGAR score? Is it neonatal? And then how far in the future are we projecting, understanding the implications, the long-term implications of perinatal injury? And as pointed out, and I was pleased to hear it, the classifications by and large do not consider fetal behavior, do not make a distinction of systemic asphyxia and regional ischemia, do not for the most part include mechanical effects, don't use the fetus as its own control. Some of them do, and do not deal with patterns of injury, which I shall share with you. I have invented my own fetal monitor machine. It works a little different from most of yours. It involves putting a microphone down and a set of headphones, and what you do is you ask the fetus a question. And the question is, what's your pH? Why? The fetus would say, I'm talking to you. So let me suggest, how are you doing? Are you behaving yourself? How did you like that contraction? As Maria pointed out, every 2 minutes, it is the only intensive care system that goes out and provokes responses. No other intensive care system kicks the patient every 2 minutes and says, how did you like that one? How did you like that one? How snug is the fit? Because certainly how well you're doing is only as important as what is the feasibility of safe vaginal delivery. Let me see if we can agree on certain objectives for our approach. The approach is to avoid neurologic injury. The approach is to predict significant risk while it is still correctable without delivery. Remember, if we're going to be starting with a normal baby, we just want to keep it that way. We want to avoid neonatal care, irrespective of whether the baby is injured or not. And we want to avoid the need to rescue the baby. Rescue cannot be a reflection of good obstetrical care. I'm not talking about prolapsed cords. I'm not talking about ruptured uterus. I'm talking about rescue of the previously normal baby undergoing a trial of labor. The more urgent that intervention is, the more problematic is the quality of the care you have provided. And perhaps paradoxical is the notion that it is our objective here to eliminate any correlation between heart rate pattern and adverse outcomes. If the system works as well as it should, all of the babies will have normal outcome and any correlation between heart rate pattern and adverse outcome will disappear. And so, as was mentioned earlier, fetal behavior, I believe, is important. This represents an understanding of fetal neurologic control over heart rate. And for this, you need to use the fetus as its own control. You need to be able to identify integrity of the system in the beginning. And you must go to the question that you are asking. Maria touched on this as well. How did you like that contraction? And you go to the next one. How did you like that one? And how did you like that one? And then maybe we can adopt the principle that we are not just deciding. If I could give you a pH meter that continuously recorded a pH, at what pH would you intervene? You see, if you had a continuously recording pH meter, you'd have to learn pH patterns. There would be pH patterns, and you'd say, this is recovered, this is not recoverable. And maybe the issue is not to see what pH we have to use to intervene, but keep the baby and the mother out of harm's way in the first place. For those of you who have seen at least 20 fetal monitor tracings, you know a couple of things. There are decelerations or there are none. There's normal baseline and variability, or there isn't. Anybody have a problem with that? Well, if it's baseline, yes, no. And if it's decelerations, yes, no, that's 4 parts. That's a classification that requires 4 parameters. And it's simple. You have normal variability, and normal and absent decelerations, and then you can make not only a feature map, but you can also put this map in condition. And what you find out, which is category 2, if you want to know what category 2 heart rate patterns are, category 2 heart rate patterns are abnormal baseline with no decelerations or decelerations with normal baseline. You do not have to memorize what the features of category 2 are. It's one of the yellow boxes. They are incompatible with each other. They do not go to one another. You were shown a different example of this. This is quiet sleep, REM sleep, active sleep, all kinds, but this is behavior. This is the neurologically responsive behavior. This is a normal heart rate tracing with a lot of uterine activity. I'm sorry for the 3 centimeters. This is the beginning of the second stage of labor, which I believe you must segregate. You cannot simply look at time, the amount of time on the monitor. You must be able to separate whether they are second stage or not. I think everybody would agree that by the time you got to category C, everybody would agree to intervene. Everybody would agree to intervene. I'm going to talk a little bit about the notion of pushing with contractions during this sequence. Notice that despite the severe decelerations, that the pushing with contractions is maintained, and when you stop pushing for a moment, the pattern changes somewhat. And the question is, when do you want to intervene? Do you want to intervene at A? Do you want to intervene at B? As I believe everybody would agree, as a minimum, everybody would agree by C. Let me suggest that you want to intervene at A. The notion that you have a normal heart rate pattern but with excessive uterine activity, and we are going to call that normal, makes no sense to me whatsoever. That is like going speeding on the highway and say, I feel okay. 120 miles an hour, I feel fine. You don't want to be there. So let me suggest we use the fetus as its own control and say, how did you like that contraction? Did you have a deceleration? And if you had a deceleration, did you take care of it properly? And what taking care of it properly means, you came back immediately to the previously normal baseline rate and variability. You can, in fact, cover the contraction and the deceleration and make a perfectly good case for the well-being of the baby, not because of the pattern of the deceleration or the duration even of the deceleration, but on the recovery of the deceleration. I want to share with you a notion, a very nice experiment by Ikeda and others, in which they put a clamp on the baby's umbilical cord, and they forgot to take it off. The pH went down to minus 20. The base deficit went down to a minus 20. The base deficit of 20, and the pH went down below 6.9. And then they took the clamp off, they allowed the baby to recover, they sacrificed the fetuses, and they looked at brain injury, and they found out that none of these things correlated with injury. That the duration of the bradycardia did not correlate, the blood gases, the pH, the base deficit, or the PO2, none of those things correlated with adverse outcome. The thing that did correlate with adverse outcome was the duration of low perfusion of the brain. But we can't measure that. And they had this interesting thing. They said it wasn't even how low the heart rate went or how long it lasted. It said what was the pattern of recovery of the heart rate. And in the pattern of recovery was the answer to the question, how did you like that one? Here's a deceleration. I'm sorry about the 3 centimeters per minute. Here you see this 3-minute deceleration. And what you say is, I think this is an acute ischemic event. I expect the baby to recover in a few minutes. And the fetus will tell you whether it has recovered or not. Notice that on the second panel, the middle panel, the pattern has changed dramatically from what was previously normal with accelerations is now an absolutely flat heart rate in which over time the decelerations that were there have disappeared. This is a seriously injured, handicapped, hypoxic ischemic injury. And the injury occurred during that deceleration. There is no other explanation. You go from that pattern on the left to this pattern on the right.
Maybe you want to use this.
Oh, sure.
If it works.
Deceleration here, flat, 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 a little sinusoidal oscillation here, and here, and here, maybe one here, and this obviously flat heart rate, somewhat higher than original, but absolutely with no variation at all. This is the injury in retrospect. In retrospect, because it is simply not possible to predict it ahead of time, you need, as the experiment showed, to be able to know what the impact on the final heart rate pattern is. This is closer to 1 centimeter, and this is a baby with deceleration, 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 but stable weight and reasonable variability. And at this point, atropine is given to the baby. Atropine. We are going to eliminate the parasympathetic control of heart rate. And look what happens. The decelerations have disappeared. No change in the maternal blood pressure, no change in contractions that we can see. We have eliminated the decelerations, we have eliminated variability, we have raised the rate, and this is a pharmacologic property of atropine. The question now is, if I show you this pattern without atropine, what is the diagnosis? That is the pattern I just showed you. And we will have a very interesting discussion in the challenge, because you will see 3 or 4 tracings which will do exactly this. I didn't put more in but you will see those tracings in the challenge where you are entitled to the prospective diagnosis of fetal neurologic injury on the basis of the heart rate tracing. And while there are other patterns, this is not the only pattern. This is far and away the most common pattern, and there are no false positives. Is it clear what we're doing? We're taking a pattern which simulates the administration of atropine, and as atropine has controlled by the 10th nerve, among others, and it is one of the places in the brain that is most susceptible to ischemic injury. If you use this pattern to identify the timing of injury, you find, for example, in vacuum-assisted deliveries, that the majority of injury occurs before the application of the vacuum. It occurs far more commonly in the 2nd stage than it is. If you now ask what are the risk factors that are associated with the appearance of this conversion, of this atropine-like pattern, if you ask what are the risk factors that are associated with it, they have, as you will see, they are heavily concentrated among those factors which reasonably represent mechanical issues during labor. So these are the risk factors of the conversion pattern. These are the risk factors for perinatal stroke and HIE, and there is overlap, a very strong overlap of HIE, fetal stroke, and the pattern I just showed you. And this has been known for 5 minutes. Be quick. Let me quickly deal with some of these relationships. The most consistent effect, as you know, it raises the intrauterine pressure contractions, but what it also does is it increases the intracranial pressure. Every contraction increases intracranial pressure, and that is offset by a rise in the blood pressure. The pressure on the fetal skull can be a multiple of the intrauterine pressure, and depending upon where you measure it, it can be up to 2 to 4 times as high. What is also true is that the pressure inside the skull, as determined by direct measurement, is always higher than the intrauterine pressure. The pressure inside the skull, you put a catheter, be careful, you put a catheter inside the skull, usually of an anomalous baby, and that pressure is always higher than the associated intrauterine pressure. And that means if the baby is going to perfuse the brain during a contraction, it has to raise its blood pressure. And if that doesn't do it, you have to recruit recruit several compensatory resources. But the most important thing is pushing. Pushing dramatically increases the pressure on the head, it increases the pressure within the head, and it increases the problems of oxygenation of the fetal head. This becomes a very important point, I believe. That relationship of intracranial pressure inside the head and the intrauterine contraction remains after the baby dies. Clear? In the baby that has died in utero, the pressure inside the head with a contraction is also greater. Think about what that means for that baby with that low heart rate in 60. That means if you are pushing with a baby with decreased blood pressure, you are adding a mechanical component, a mechanical impairment to cerebral blood flow on top of the problem of perfusion, the problem of fetal well-being. You cannot outrace fetal distress by pushing. You need to optimize the blood flow. Lest you doubt that mechanical factors play a role, these are babies who are normal. Babies who are normal have intracranial hemorrhage. They have subdural, especially posterior. They have slit ventricles at the time of birth. That means that amniotic cerebrospinal fluid is being squeezed out during labor. They can have severe molding. You can show decelerations with pressure on the head. You have early decelerations, which clearly are a reflection of impaired blood flow. The point of all of these observations in normals is they are all eliminated by elective cesarean section. There is no escaping the role, I believe, of mechanical forces in labor. Under these circumstances, I obviously don't believe that decelerations are benign. The notion of a benign deceleration, a deceleration being benign, simply because the pH is normal, I'm not sure makes a lot of sense to me when you are talking about changes in cerebral blood flow and potential impairment of fetal blood flow. Anyway, we should also understand that as the second stage of labor increases, all of these adverse consequences increase as well. The need for rescue, the abnormalities of the tracing, the amount of distortion of the head and things like that. And so we need to be very careful about this second stage of labor. Fetal monitoring, I would hope, is here to stay. It tells us more about fetal well-being than what's your pH. It also is, I believe, we'll talk about this tomorrow, the next day, used for the basis for neuroprotection, because as I've tried to show you, we're coming to understand that we haven't been cooling all the right babies. It does not tell you and cannot tell you when to intervene. It doesn't have, as smart as they're getting, it's not a computer, and it does not represent the totality of obstetrical care. I leave you with a horse in the woods. I understand you can't see the whole horse. Hopefully you can see the direction the horse is going. Thomas Pynchon said if they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers, which is the corollary to Einstein's quote. And Agatha Christie said, "How much do we know at any time? Much more or so I believe, then we know we know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very intense talk, also very provocative, so I will allow myself the first question. I guess we are all aware that pH is not what we would like to have. When you're on the signal processing side and you want to automatize, when you're on the signal processing side and you want to automatize something, you need to have a benchmark to know whether what you are doing makes sense, or if you're progressing or improving. Or pH is, I would say, what the best we have so far. So, and we understand that from your perspective, pH is not what we should use. So my question is, what should we use that can be quantified instead of pH in the data, and how do you see the future of signal processing in fetal monitoring?
The normal fetal tracing is reasonably predictive to an extraordinary degree of normal neurologic behavior and outcome. The objective is to keep it that way. That, it seems to me, to be the role you have. You need to go from deciding metaphorically at what pH we're going to intervene in, from avoiding the need to rescue this fetus. That has to, it seems to me. And there was a suggestion of improvement in the need for urgent intervention. So if you want the short-term metrics, pick emergency, the avoidance of emergency intervention in a previously normal baby undergoing the trial of labor. It seems to me that is an irrefutable measure of the quality of obstetrical care. It's not only, think about it, somebody has been induced for labor, and not only did they not get a vaginal delivery, there was a crash cesarean section or a crash vacuum to affect delivery. That's a double failure. You missed on the estimate of the vaginal delivery, okay, but you also missed on what was a normal baby to start with, and you have created some risk. And that risk prevails whether the baby's going to be injured or not. You're mobilizing resources from other people. Crash cesarean sections are no fun under any circumstances. So that's one approach. The other approach is, why don't you have the courage of your own convictions and use normal tracing as a measure of outcome? And as I've suggested, there is a way to begin to define not only injury, but decompensation as well. And so these, it seems to me, are the approach. And this just the idea of avoiding.
But if I want to be provocative, I would say that everything that people have been doing in signal processing, which is to try to, let's say, quantify the FIGO features and propose new signal processing features, is based on this idea that you want to measure how far you are from normal. That's what, essentially, that's what people are doing.
We're agreed. The point I'm trying to come to is you're waiting too long to figure out how far down the slope you are. And what I'm suggesting is that, as I tried to show you, for example, if you have 6 contractions in 10 minutes and a normal tracing, is that normal? The answer is no. For me, okay? Is that part of the alarm? We'll discuss this more on Wednesday for those of you who are here on how all of these notions have been applied to an actual algorithm for dealing with laboring patients. And so these are issues. The issue is simply not to figure out how far away it goes. I'm trying to suggest you have information much earlier, okay, about recovery from the decelerations, about trends in heart rate and variability, and that those will in fact, not by intervention, but by course corrections, by controlled pushing.
But could not we say, for example, these alerts, which with colors that we're proposing in the morning, is it not exactly that idea?
What?
There was a system of alerts which tried to say how dangerous or how bad the situation is in the past and etc. Is it not what people are already trying to do in some sense?
No, I would hope they were. This is an attempt to voice these issues. Is an attempt to voice these issues and alert. We're agreeing that there are alerts. We're agreeing that you have to pick those alerts. And what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, refine how long it takes to get to the alert, okay? In the sense that maybe you need to intervene more without doing the delivery, and you need to intervene in a sense earlier and to avoid the need for these interventions. And the other important thing that was raised is this issue of contractions. Okay, this is an integral part, and I believe you're going to have separate algorithms for the second stage than you do for the first stage. You cannot have you can't use the same algorithms, and as I'll show you on Wednesday, the number of contractions that are permissible in the second stage must go down. You cannot have the same criteria for excessive uterine activity where you get away with lots of contractions. In the first stage of labor, you simply don't get away with that in the second stage of labor. Sure?
Yeah, I enjoyed your talk. Every time I hear you speak for the last 50 years, you think a little bit different than everybody else. That's a good thing. I think the important thing for the engineers to understand, like, why are we doing this work? They have to listen to you. Is that on the slide that you had, the 2x2 slide,
Right.
the green, the 2 yellows, and the
Right.
red, the opportunities for the 2 boxes that are yellow. If it's a normal rate, normal variability, that baby doesn't need to be monitored, as it is not most places. The advantage to monitoring that patient, however, is it might become a 2 or a yellow. If it's a red, that baby needs to be.
Right, that's red's not an issue.
So it's easy, and you're right, but good signal processing, better than we've got now, would better inform. If I've got a tracing that suddenly I develop very little deceleration that I think look okay, and then, geez, look what happened, there was a big deceleration, now there's that cardiac shift, should have looked this maybe 10 minutes ago. Well, better signal processing would have, in a perfect world, should differentiate the 2 patients that are green, moving to yellow, and one is going to recover and become green again, and the other one's going to turn red, if you will. And that's really what the goal of our colleagues in engineering have to help
We are
us
all
with.
aware of that. The question is how to do that.
No.
Well, I understand, but it's not all, I think it's not all, like, I really resent in the United States at least, people who don't do obstetrics, and they know who they are, there's 18 of them on one of those.
Yeah, right.
papers, who tell me how to practice obstetrics based on a tracing. When the purpose of the tracing is to be able to describe what you see.
Totally agree, but to do that from a signal processing perspective or a computer perspective, we would need that each part of the data is annotated so that we have the ground truth for each segment. Because then we are able to check whether indeed we correctly
But
define
truth
that the
changes.
yellow or green.
Truth changes. That's the problem.
Of course, truth changes.
Terry?
Yeah.
There was one question, Peter.
I'd like to make just a couple of comments. The first one is actually follow up to what Patrice said. For us, in signal processing, we don't really care if use pH values to label the data or something else. We can use just adverse outcomes or not. You just tell us what we consider to be the case. With that, we can proceed the same way as we do now, as the first one. So we just need to know what is considered, so the particular table cartridge series, what are the outcomes?
What you are seeing here is an experience based on several thousand brain damaged baby tracings, several thousand of them. There is a commonality to these tracings of injury. There is a commonality to these tracings of injury, and they reflect the changes, the progressive changes that I have tried to describe for you. Sherry and I would almost certainly agree that we can't read enough tracings to matter. You are the people who are going to define what we get out of tracings across the population. What I'm hoping I have done to some small extent is to share with you some notions of, some intuitive notions that you can somehow program into the programs that we need. That we can't keep going with visual interpretation. It's amazing what you see when you watch some of these babies deteriorate.
I didn't mean that we get actual annotations from segment to segment. What I meant was at the end, was there adverse outcome or not? Okay, that's all.
We have one last question.
And then just, I want to
No.
know.
Chris?
Patrice.
Just, there is something that this discussion will continue, right? This is how we ended last time 2 years ago. This is ongoing. What are we trying to predict? So in a way, that's why we want to cut it a bit short. But keep on going. Talk to Barry afterwards. Keep on. We will discuss this later today, later tomorrow. It's a huge problem in signal processing. We need to know when to punish or reward our victims.
We can discuss it later. Just a light-hearted comment. I think that the slide with Einstein was a little bit too general. I'll give you a counterexample. In computer vision, very often neural networks were used to recognize what is on screen. And until 2006, what was happening was exactly what you saw on that screen. But since then, things changed. Now, computers can actually see or understand pictures much better than humans.
I agree. I want you to come back and say to me, using this algorithm, I have reduced to nil or almost nil the frequency of emergency intervention in a previously normal baby undergoing labor. That's
Without
what I want.
increasing hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy.
Right. No, that's yes. Or obviously, I don't want you sending more people to the nursery, to the intensive care unit. I don't want any more low pHs. But the point.
Okay, we're gonna have the challenge.
pH doesn't matter.
We're gonna have a challenge tomorrow to continue this very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.